how does entrenchment happen in situations where inequality is large and where inequality is rising? And I'd like to go through a classic economics graph and some game theory. You don't have to know game theory to follow what I'm saying, but I think these ideas are really important. So let's start with this graph, which is a graph that goes along with the Gini coefficient, if you're familiar with that in economics. But the basic idea is on the y-axis, we have usually percent of wealth in the nation or percent of income. Now, I think this actually might make even more sense if we used percent of power. Even though power is this nebulous thing that's difficult to measure, I think you can think of it either way. And then on the x-axis, we have percent of the people. And all of this, of course, is going to be compared to a world where everything is perfectly equal, in which case, if everything is perfectly equal, if you're at 50% of the population, then they're going to collectively own 50% of the wealth. So that's just how to read this graph, is if we had a straight line, 50% of the people would own 50% of the wealth, 80% of the people would own 80% of the wealth. That's if everything is equal. Now, of course, because things are not equal, you're always going to have some curve that looks like this. And in a really, really unequal society, the curve is like a hockey stick. So the way I've drawn it, it looks like the bottom 50% of the people who own wealth or have power own about, say, maybe 15% of the wealth. That's the way I've drawn this curve. Now, to think about entrenchment, I want to start to think about two people who are at the 90th percentile on this graph and two people who are at like the 30th percentile. And I want to think of these people in particular as competing with each other. And of course, they may be competing to move up in the hierarchy, or they may be competing along some other lines. But there is some competition between these people. But there's also going to be cooperation between these people because they want to make sure that they maintain their status. And to drop even like 3 or 5% on this diagram would be a huge drop for them in their status in society. So these people have both an incentive to cooperate and an incentive to compete. And that brings up game theory. So are there games in game theory where people both cooperate and compete? And there are going to be multiple such games, but one of the more classic ones is called Battle of the Sexes. And I think this is actually going to do a good job of helping us think about what's going on between these people up here at the 90th percentile. So let me just draw out Battle of the Sexes. The way Battle of the Sexes actually works is you have a woman and a man who are in a relationship and they're trying to decide, do they go to the ballet or do they go to football? And the woman prefers the ballet, the man prefers football, but they would both prefer to be together at the same event rather than each going off to their separate events. So the off equilibrium here is 0-0 for both of them because they don't get to be together. So we have actually two Nash equilibriums in this case, but there's a different preferred Nash for both people, for each of the two in the couple. So this captures cooperation and competition at the same time, where both of them want to cooperate to end up in one of these two Nashes to avoid the off equilibrium that they don't like, and yet they're both competing about which of the two Nashes they end up with. And of course, we know how couples work this problem out. They work it out oftentimes by going back and forth between who gets to decide what they do that weekend. So the question is, how does this scenario map onto this? And what I would actually say about this is that these two people up here, they have an important role in the system. They live at the 90th percentile, meaning that they probably have a little bit of power to determine who moves up in this hierarchy. They probably have money that they can choose which causes they donate that money to, which parts of the economy they are making grow or making shrink based on their decisions. So these people have some power. But their cooperation and competition is in some ways about things that would help their particular cause against their competitor versus things that would help people at the bottom versus them. And I would think of this as these two people are competitors at their level, at their 90th percentile level, and they have things that they're very passionate about that they believe they should win over their buddy. And that is really about this competition element in the Nash equilibrium. Whereas if we think about both of these people want to make sure that that they aren't disrupted from their place in this hierarchy, because it's a pretty good place. So anything that would cause them to fall in this inequality hierarchy would put them in this off equilibrium. And so they're going to work together cooperatively to make sure anything that disrupts this too much doesn't happen. Now, how does this relate to the level of inequality in an economy? And I think that relates to the off equilibrium here. What if I disrupted the off equilibrium by making this negative 100 in both of these spaces? I have not actually changed any of the Nash equilibrium by doing that. They still both want to end up in one of these two squares. But now it's really, really important for both of them to cooperate to make sure we don't end up in one of these off equilibriums. And what do the off equilibriums represent here? I think in a lot of ways the off equilibriums would represent these people rejiggering the system such that they could move up, or such that their conditions got a greater share of the attention from policymakers and from people who are structuring the economy, such that perhaps if there is a rejiggering, there's at least some chance that these people's rank might fall. And of course, these people aren't going to fall from the 90th percentile to the 30th percentile. That's not how any disruption works. But if these people would fall from, say, the 90th to the 80th percentile in any kind of restructuring that might help people at the bottom, that's a huge drop for them. So the more and more unequal things are, the bigger the drop things would be if the current system were disrupted. Like a 10% drop versus a 2% drop, that's a huge difference for these people. And it's going to influence this off equilibrium. Now, I'm not going to go into the deep game theory here because, of course, you know, the battle between these two people may actually end up where sometimes they're in this off equilibrium because one of them is like, I'm tired of doing football all the time. I want to go to the ballet. I'm going to go off by myself so that we're in one of these equilibrium to make sure that you're sharing this equally. So there's all kinds of dynamics like that going on. But if what this represents, this off equilibrium, is a foot in the door for these people to have a say in the competition between these people, that's really, really dangerous. And it's more and more dangerous the more unequal society becomes. Now, one other thing I want to say here is oftentimes in the battle between these two people, they recruit people at the lower levels to support them, to be like, the population wants me to gain power, wants me to gain status. So oftentimes there is a mapping of these two people at the bottom onto these people higher in the hierarchy. And this once again represents the cooperative and competitive environment even among people at the 30th percentile. Like, these people have disagreements with each other. They're trying to compete for those disagreements, but they might want to cooperate against people who are up here in disrupting the system, perhaps. So there's battle of the sexes games going on between pairs at every single level of this hierarchy. And that actually brings me to the next point, which is if you zoom in on the top part of this diagram, you're going to actually get the same dynamics that you have if you have the whole diagram on the board. So let's actually do this. Okay, I had to scrunch it a little bit, but imagine that this diagram has the exact same shape as this diagram, where we're zooming in on the people from the 90th percentile to the 100th percentile on this graph. And here we have people at the 99th percentile versus people at the 90th percentile. And these people have exponentially more than these people, even though we would consider these people incredibly wealthy, incredibly well off. If we're looking at them from the 30th percentile or the 50th percentile or even the 80th percentile, these people are super, super rich and powerful. But the dynamic between these two groups is actually the same as the dynamic up here. And I think this competition and cooperation thing is still going on between these two groups, where these people at the very top, they're competitive people by nature because there's a distribution of how competitive people are in the economy, and those who end up at the top tend to be on the upper end of that distribution in terms of how naturally competitive they are. And so they are definitely competing with each other, and they're competing with each other on multiple, in multiple realms. I mean, politically, but also socially, also artistically. There's so many ways that these people compete. But they cooperate to make sure these people at the 90th percentile don't move up and displace them. And similarly, we may have a mapping of desires and competitive nature between this pair that's competing onto this pair at the 99th percentile. So this is cooperation across different parts of the top 10% of the income distribution, and competition. This is representing that dynamic going on. But the more unequal things are, the more fearful this group is of people down here. And the thing is, I could do this same exercise if I zoomed in to the top 1%, where these two people are exactly at the 99th percentile, and these people are at the 99.99th percentile. There's the same dynamic of competition and cooperation where these people have a strong incentive to make sure that the system isn't disrupted so much that these people can come up and bump them off or displace them. So the fact that this dynamic exists on every single level of this income distribution spectrum, that's what causes so much entrenchment. It's because every single level is afraid of dropping on the income distribution because people are loss averse. They hate losing things, especially if they feel they've put a lot of hard work into gaining what they've gained. So any kind of proposal to disrupt the system, perhaps to make it easier for these people to move up in the hierarchy based on their own merit, any such proposal is going to be a threat, essentially, to anyone on this spectrum who's afraid of what would happen if they fell by 5% or 10% in this new income distribution with any new rules.